Parliament view from here.
Morning, Your Excellency. Guard of Honor, mark the official opening of the first session of the 9th Parliament of Zimbabwe, mounted by Presidential Guard, composed of 6 officers, 104 other ranks, band and drums from Zimbabwe Corps of City, all formed up in open order, ready for inspection, Your Excellency. section. Permission to carry on, Your Excellency.
Yes, we continue to give you proceedings here from Parliament building. We've just seen the President inspecting the guard of honor, and we saw the fly past as well, as we continue giving you proceedings at the official opening of the first session of the 9th Parliament of Zimbabwe by President Emmerson Mnangagwa. It is the first session of the 9th Parliament, which was elected on 30 July 2018 through the harmonized elections. Now I'm now joined by the Executive Director of the Southern Africa Parliamentary Support Trust, Mr. John Makamure, just to unpack what this day means. Mr. Makamure, it is a warm welcome. What does the official opening mean? What does it mean when we say the Parliament is being officially opened?
Thank you very much. It's provided for in section 140 of the Constitution, where the President, at any time, he can address either House of Parliament or a joint sitting of the two houses. And also the same section says the President, at least once a year, he has to present the State of the Nation address. So basically this is the first State of the Nation address by the President, in line with section 140 of the Constitution, and is taking the opportunity to also officially open the 9th Parliament of Zimbabwe, where he's going to outline the legislative agenda and other issues that the MPs can now, in terms of their legislative and oversight functions, what the President is going to say will lay the basis for the MPs to carry out their legislative and oversight functions.
As we see the judiciary there coming in to Parliament, Mr. Makamure, what is the role of a member of Parliament?
In summary, the role of a member of Parliament is to legislate or to make law. Then the other function is to provide oversight on the work of the government, in particular the executive. And then the other function is to represent. And when we say representations, we are talking about representing the wishes and aspirations of the people.
Now, some people think an MP must be able to build a clinic, must be able to build a school, must provide cement to build a deep tank. Is that the role of a member of Parliament? If you can explain on that aspect. Yeah,
indirectly, yes, a member of Parliament is required to make sure that the environment is created and that the legal framework is in place for the clinics and the roads and the schools to be constructed. So the Member of Parliament does that by coming here to Parliament and making sure that the necessary laws are enacted. That is the primary function of the legislature, is to enact legislation. But also the Member of Parliament must follow up on the implementation of government programs and projects, such as construction of schools, hospitals, things like that, and make sure that those who are implementing those policies and programs are held to account. And that is done here, where the Member of Parliament has to ask questions to ministers, has to introduce motions so that members debate, and the minister is then required to respond and provide information on how the programs and projects are being implemented.
We know that we have the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. Now, the legislature, how does it fit into the whole matrix of the arms of government?
Yes, those are the three arms of the state. The judiciary is there to interpret, the laws that are made by Parliament. And let me also just clarify that the legislature in Zimbabwe is provided in the constitution, comprises Parliament and the President.
Mr. Makamure, we are seeing the coming into Parliament of the legislators, which you are talking about. You can continue explaining what the legislature how it fits into the whole matrix of the arms of the state.
Yeah, it fits in very well because the laws that are made by Parliament have to be interpreted by the judiciary and the executive. So there are three arms: the executive, legislature, and Parliament. The executive has to implement the laws and policies that are made by Parliament, and the judiciary has to interpret. And the Constitution provides for separation of powers, that no arm should interfere with the duties of the other. But let me say that the duties are complementary. But you want the work of Parliament not to interfere with the work of the judiciary, the work of the judiciary not to interfere with the work of the executive, but all of them, their duties complement, so that you realize the good governance that we all yearn for.
Now let us look at the various committees that make up Parliament. You can take us through some of the committees. We know there are standing committees, there are thematic committees. Take us through those committees and the roles that they play to ensure that Parliament plays that oversight role and the legislature role that we are talking about.
Yes, there are two houses. There is the National Assembly, where you find portfolio committees. The portfolio committees mirror the ministries that we have. So the portfolio committees provide oversight on the work of ministries. Then in the Senate, we have thematic committees. Thematic committees deal with broad issues, right? So for example, you can have a thematic committee on health, HIV, AIDS. It's basically dealing with broad health matters. When legislation is introduced in Parliament, it can be introduced in either house, but it is referred to portfolio committees. So it is portfolio committees that have now to, analyze, the draft pieces of legislation, consult citizens, and then present their findings or recommendations in the House for debate. So the committees play a central role in the work of Parliament. In other words, the committees are the engine of Parliament. That's where most of the work is undertaken. And over the years, the committee system in Zimbabwe has really grown. And we have committees that have become more and more assertive and are demanding accountability. But there's need to invest more in the committee system. And why? Because the committee system is the engine of parliamentary work.
Let us look at the fact that today it is the official opening of the 9th Parliament. I know you watch what happens in Parliament. We had the 8th Parliament. What are some of those things that which come to mind to say these were left hanging in the 8th Parliament and you expect to see them being taken over by the 9th Parliament?
Yes, there is unfinished business. In particular, the alignment process, aligning laws with the Constitution. It's a process we know. But we are hoping that this 9th Parliament will accelerate the process and complete the alignment process. But it's not only aligning existing legislation with the Constitution, it is also about enactment of new legislation that will, for example, support the thrust towards economic revival. So you need the proper legal framework to be in place for business to thrive and for the economy to recover. So that is a priority for this new Parliament. And then also, the last Parliament did very well in terms of trying to reach out to citizens. But there is still a long way to go. You want your citizens to feel that they are meaningfully consulted and that they are involved in parliamentary business. And because that is provided for in section 141 of the Constitution, which requires that Parliament has to consult citizens before making any major decisions. But you want your citizens to really feel that they are being consulted. So there's still more work to be done in that area. There's another method that citizens were using to engage Parliament, that is the petition process. So you want more and more Zimbabweans to utilize petitioning of Parliament because it's a constructive mechanism for meaningful engagement. So citizens have to be educated on how you petition Parliament so that their issues are addressed.
Let us look at, in brief, the roles of chief whips. We've heard that we know the opposition as a chief whip, but the ruling party as a chief whip. In brief, what are their roles in Parliament as we wind up this discussion?
Right, the chief whips play a very important role. They are the leaders of members in Parliament to make sure that the party's interests, the political party's interests, are fully taken care of in Parliament. And these are the people that make sure that issues that are before Parliament, all members are fully familiar with those issues and coordinate how the members will make contributions during debate. So they play a very crucial role. That's what we call the whipping system. But some people look at it in a negative manner to say whipping is about members supporting unpopular decisions. But what we are simply saying is whipping can also mean that the party is properly coordinated and that when members are making contributions, they do it from an informed position.
Mr. Makamure, thank you very much for your time and explaining some of these issues pertaining to today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wadzenai.
Tuesday, 18 September 2018, it is a warm welcome to Parliament Building. It is the official opening of the first session of the 9th Parliament of Zimbabwe, which will be officially opened by President Emmerson Mnangagwa. We are also expecting the State of the Nation address, people call it SONA, today also by President Mnangagwa, and he will be tabling the legislative agenda for this session following the elections that were held on 30 July 2018. Nogamchirai mure Zimbabwe tiri ku parliament ye Zimbabwe naso uno kuri kuzarwa chikamu chekutanga cheparliament yepfumbamwe nemutungamiri wenyika Mthwakazi Omuhle kwamukela kumagumba mane eZimbabwe namhlanje ke separliament yikho lapho kwenzakala khona ukuvulwa kweparliament ihlandla lakuqala ele parliament yesificamunwe munye ngumongameli Mnangagwa. Now I'm now joined by a lawyer, Rose Zigomo, just to take us through what it means when we say the president will be laying the legislative agenda or government's legislative agenda for this session. Rose, it is a warm welcome. Today is the official opening of the first session of the 9th Parliament of Zimbabwe. Now, what does it mean to Zimbabweans, and what does it mean when we say the president will lay out the legislative agenda for this session?
Every opening of Parliament, every session that starts, the President of the country will normally lay out the legislative priorities of the government, what his priorities are in respect of fulfilling the social, economic development targets of the country. And so he will list out in his speech those key legislative targets that he wishes his ministries to fulfill in this parliamentary session. Those legislative targets obviously are tied to government policy, the policies that the ministries will be working hard on in this particular term and the following term. That would be, I would assume, in this particular year and next year, primarily economic targets. They have already key performance targets that they have to fulfill as ministries. So they would have indicated to the President prior to this that in respect of meeting those key performance targets, there's specific legislation that they wish to make sure Parliament pushes through in this 9th session of Parliament. So these are essentially the priorities of government where it concerns legislation. What are the key acts of Parliament that need to be passed in Parliament in the 9th session that will help government to achieve its socioeconomic targets?
Now, Rosa, when the President has done that, what then is the role of Parliament? What then happens? What does the Parliament then have to do after that tabling of that legislative agenda?
Well, one of the powers of Parliament is to initiate legislation. So in terms of its own capacity, they can proceed to write or initiate, draft their own and prepare their own legislation, which they believe meet the targets of the President in respect of his legislative priorities. In addition to that, the Speaker of Parliament needs to meet with the President and the Chief Whips and various other key personnel in Parliament to set out the business agenda of the 9th session of Parliament, which will then indicate which pieces of legislation are going to go first, how long it will take that legislation to come into Parliament. For example, if those pieces of legislation are being written by the executive, how long will it take those specific acts to come into Parliament for their first and second readings? If there are any areas that Parliament are actually drafting themselves, when will those pieces of legislation come into Parliament? That way they are able to then set out the calendar or the business of Parliament when it will sit to hear those principles of legislation and debate them, and if the legislative committee obviously will have a look at those pieces of legislation, recommend any amendments. If they have to go back to the drawing board, all of that has to be planned, it has to be scheduled, and the President would need to be in charge of that as he is the head of government business.
Now, as you look at it in your own experience, the initiation of these laws, the legislation, does it come more from the executive or it comes from the legislature itself, Parliament?
The tradition appears in practice to be that most legislation comes from the executive. As we know, the ministries are the managers of a particular sector. So they will be, I guess, more sensitive to what are the priorities that that particular sector wants initiated in Parliament in that particular 9th session. So we have seen most bills coming or being initiated and prepared by government. And by that I mean that the Attorney General's office has a legislative drafting department that receives the requests of ministries in any given term to draft pieces of legislation, and then the Cabinet sits as the Cabinet Committee on Legislation, headed by the Minister of Justice, to consider the bills that would have come through, and then once they are at a certain stage, they go through to Cabinet for a general debate and discussion, and if approved, they then come to Parliament. So that has been the norm. Although, of course, we have seen in the past few years, I would say probably in the past 5 years, or a little bit more, Parliament has now begun initiating legislation, and you will see private members' bills that have been discussed and debated over the past possibly 8 years. And this is something that should be encouraged because this is the role of Parliament.
How critical is it for the President to come here today and lay that agenda? Is it the norm elsewhere? Is it something that's constitutional? What does it mean when we have the President coming in to do that?
This is important in terms of transparency and accountability of government. As you know, there are three sectors of government. There is the legislature, there is judiciary, and there is the executive. The executive and every other organ of government is accountable to Parliament. Parliament must know what are the policies and the pieces of legislation that are coming, that government is working on. And then they hold government to account for those policies and that legislation. So it allows the various parliamentary committees to be able to do their job now that they know what are the priorities of government. It is a way in which the both sectors of the government, that is the legislature and the executive, work together in tandem and work together to achieve specific goals for the nation. It's also important that the nation knows what are government priorities, because we've gone through an election, there have been promises that have been made, and there are certain needs of communities at large. When they hear the president speak what his priorities are, and those are the priorities of government, it gives them a sense of confidence that government is going to be hard at work over the 9th session of Parliament to achieve those priorities. And they can ask their representatives in Parliament, what has happened to this particular goal or this particular act that you had indicated was going to be passed in Parliament?
Rose, thank you very much for your time, and we'll be coming back to you, but thank you so much for your time. We're talking there to Rose Zigomo, a lawyer, just explaining what it means when the president officially opens parliament and lays down the government legislative agenda, and also talking about where the motions come from. It could be from the executive or from parliament itself. It is the official opening of the first session of the 9th parliament today here at Parliament Building in the capital Harare by His Excellency President Emmerson Mnangagwa Zimbabwe. Ndoka azurikuitika kuno change zviitika kuno kuvhurwa zviri pamutemo kweparamende chikamu chekutanga cheparamende yechipfumbamwe nemutungamiri wenyika yebo kambe mthwakazo muhle besikhuluma ngale qwetha uRose Zigomo ecasi ukuthi ke kuyino kwenzakalayo namhlanje njalo kuchoni nxa imithetho isungulwa eParliament isungulwa njalo singathi ke ku-executive ibuya ke eParliament icaziwe ngapha kukhulunywe ngayo ngapha bese kusithi ke nxa sokungumthetho ubususayinwa ke ngumongameli welizwe. So